am going to tell you a story about revenge, but not the kind that ends with shouting or sirens. This is the kind that lives quietly for years, the kind that wears a normal life like a coat and still keeps its hands busy underneath. Nothing in this story happens fast, because the world rarely punishes powerful people quickly. The world punishes them slowly, and usually only when someone is patient enough to make the consequences impossible to ignore. I was 24 when the fire took my family. That is the clean sentence, the one people understand immediately, the one that allows them to nod and offer sympathy. It is not the whole truth, because the fire did not only take them. It also took my belief that the system was designed to protect ordinary people. It took my trust in timelines, in promises, in the idea that hard work and good intentions create safety. After that night, I began to see how many things are held together by assumptions, and how quickly those assumptions fail when profit, convenience, and distance are involved. We lived in a building the city described with the kind of soft language that hides reality: transitional housing, aging infrastructure, a property scheduled for redevelopment. Words like that make a place sound temporary, and when something is temporary, neglect becomes easier to justify. It becomes easier for inspectors to look away, easier for owners to delay repairs, easier for officials to say they will address it later. Later is a dangerous word. My mother did not trust later. She was not dramatic, not aggressive, not the sort of person who picked fights. She simply noticed things and insisted they mattered. The hallway lights flickered too often. The outlet in our kitchen sparked when you plugged in the kettle. The wiring buzzed behind the walls on humid days. A neighbor mentioned a burning smell near the stairwell, and my mother wrote it down like evidence, because she believed that evidence would eventually force someone to act. She filed complaints. She sent emails. She left voicemails. She spoke to property management representatives who sounded friendly and powerless at the same time. She did everything people tell you to do when something is unsafe. She did not know that doing everything right does not always lead to a right outcome. My sister Emily was 16. She had that mix of confidence and softness you only get once in life, when you are old enough to have opinions and still young enough to believe the world can be reasoned with. She played violin in the evenings. She was not a prodigy, but she practiced like she was. She would stop every few minutes to ask my mother whether a phrase sounded smoother, whether the rhythm was more certain, whether she was improving. My mother always told her yes. Even on days when my mother looked tired, she told her yes. I was working late the night the fire started. It was not a heroic sacrifice, not a desperate struggle to survive. It was an ordinary decision that looked responsible in the moment. I was covering an extra shift because my manager asked, and because saying no too often comes with consequences that never show up in writing. I remember thinking I would bring home takeout. I remember thinking Emily would complain about vegetables. I remember thinking my mother would lecture me gently about overworking for people who did not deserve my loyalty. Those thoughts stayed intact. They survived in my mind in a way my family did not. By the time I arrived, the street was already blocked off. Emergency lights strobed against the snow and made everything feel unreal, as if the world had turned into a scene that someone else was filming. People stood barefoot in winter coats, not because they were calm, but because shock makes you forget you have a body. Someone tried to hold me back when I ran toward the building. Someone said my name like it was a warning. Someone else spoke in a soft, rehearsed tone and told me there were no survivors. I remember the shape of those words more than their sound. No survivors. The official report said the fire was caused by an electrical failure due to outdated wiring. The unofficial truth was that the wiring had been flagged before. Complaints had been filed. Repairs had been delayed. The building was old, and the owner had decided the risk was acceptable. That is what negligence looks like in real life. It rarely looks like cruelty. It looks like a calculation that treats other people's lives as a line item. The owner's name was Victor Hale. I did not learn that from a confession or an apology. I learned it from paperwork. That felt fitting, because Victor Hale lived at a distance from consequences. Distance was his talent. He owned dozens of properties across the city, held through layers of companies with names that sounded harmless and forgettable. He donated to charities. He smiled in photographs with city officials. He spoke publicly about affordable housing and community investment. He did not come to the funeral. His company sent flowers. The message on the card said something about condolences and cooperation. Cooperation is a word people use when they want to sound responsible without admitting fault. For a while, I tried justice. I hired a lawyer who spoke carefully and charged generously. I gathered every email my mother had sent, every complaint number, every inspection history we could obtain through public records. I watched my lawyer build a case that looked convincing to ordinary people and unthreatening to powerful ones. The opposing legal team did not look worried. They did not need to. They delayed, challenged, and buried us under motions that took hours to answer and minutes to file. They treated my grief like a negotiation. At one point, my lawyer suggested a settlement that would cover funeral costs and a modest amount for emotional damages. The phrase, emotional damages, made my stomach turn. It sounded like a price tag on a life. I declined, not because the money would not have helped, but because I understood what acceptance would mean. It would mean the fire could be reduced to a number, and numbers can be absorbed, written off, and forgotten. The case collapsed anyway. People expected me to fall apart after that. They expected rage or addiction or some visible self-destruction that made sense of the story they wanted to tell. They wanted tragedy to be tidy. They wanted the victim to look like a victim so they could feel compassionate and then move on. Instead, I became quiet. Quiet enough that people mistook it for healing. It was not healing. It was control. In the months after the case ended, I stopped trying to persuade anyone. I stopped expecting officials to care. I stopped believing that moral outrage creates change on its own. I began to observe how the world actually worked, and once you start looking closely, it becomes impossible not to notice the patterns. Power does not protect itself through secrecy. Power protects itself through structure, through layers, through plausible deniability, through committees and subcontractors and protocols that keep responsibility moving until it becomes abstract. When harm occurs, the system offers explanations, not always lies, but explanations that are smooth enough to make the harm feel inevitable. I learned to hate inevitability. I went back to school, not for inspiration, not to reinvent myself in a hopeful way. I went back because I needed to understand how Victor Hale stayed untouchable. I studied accounting, regulatory compliance, and corporate systems. I learned how money can move without looking like it moved. I learned how companies can be designed to absorb blame and protect individuals. I learned how inspection reports are written to satisfy requirements while avoiding conclusions. I learned how risk is measured in ways that rarely include the people most likely to be harmed. By the time I finished, I had a skill set that was useful in places where people rarely notice the person doing the work. That was exactly what I needed. I took jobs that made me invisible: assistant roles, analyst roles, compliance roles, work that required meticulous attention and rewarded silence. I became the person who checked the boxes, who kept the records, who knew how regulations could be interpreted in ways that were technically correct and morally empty. I learned how men like Victor Hale operated without ever raising their voice. They did not need to. The system raised it for them. Years passed. Victor Hale expanded. New developments rose. Old buildings were renovated or demolished. The city changed and pretended that change meant progress. Victor Hale appeared in newspapers, smiling next to mayors and commissioners. He spoke about responsibility and legacy in a tone that suggested he believed those words belonged to him. The world rewarded him for surviving. I did not reward him with my attention. I simply waited. The opportunity arrived in a way that felt almost ordinary. Victor Hale's company announced a new residential development on reclaimed industrial land: luxury apartments, sustainable design, community spaces. It was the kind of project that looked generous on brochures and predatory in practice. The public language emphasized affordability quotas. The internal language emphasized margins. They needed compliance consultants. I joined through a subcontractor, several layers removed from the top. My resume was solid but not flashy. My background was unremarkable enough to be safe. No one asked why I was interested. People rarely ask why someone is thorough. They just benefit from it until thoroughness becomes inconvenient. From the inside, I saw the same familiar pattern. Corners were not cut in a way that looked like crime. They were cut in a way that looked like efficiency. Safety standards were treated as flexible. Inspection schedules were arranged so that the building looked good on the day it mattered. Reports emphasized percentages and compliance metrics rather than describing conditions honestly. Everything was designed to be defensible. That is how negligence survives. I documented everything, not as an act of protest, as an act of preparation. I wrote emails requesting clarification. I attached photos when something looked questionable. I logged meeting notes with neutral language. I saved drafts and revisions. I stored records redundantly. I made sure that if anyone ever needed to see the truth, it would exist in a form that could not be dismissed as personal opinion. At the same time, I understood that evidence alone is not enough. Evidence needs a context strong enough to withstand the pressure that comes when powerful people feel threatened. So I built context. I did not leak a dramatic file to a single reporter. I released small pieces of information over time to different journalists who did not know each other. I chose details that were credible and boring. Inspection schedules, contract structures, the language used in internal risk assessments. On their own, those pieces looked like routine. Together, they formed a pattern. Patterns are harder to argue with than accusations. The first article that appeared did not mention Victor Hale by name. It discussed regulatory interpretation across multiple developments in the city. It quoted experts. It spoke about systemic incentives. It treated the issue like a professional concern rather than a moral scandal. That was important, because moral scandal invites defensive theater. Professional concern invites oversight. Victor Hale responded publicly with calm cooperation. He praised transparency. He welcomed inspections. He spoke about best practices. He did not realize he had just tied his reputation to standards his company could not consistently meet. Over the next months, scrutiny increased. Agencies requested more documentation. Inspections became less predictable. Timelines slipped. Meetings grew longer. Emails became cautious. Decisions that once happened casually were deferred and rephrased until they sounded responsible. Inside the project, people became tense. Not because they felt guilty, because they felt exposed. Then something happened that I had not engineered. An internal audit uncovered cost reallocations that did not look illegal at first glance, but could not be justified cleanly. Funds moved through shell vendors, services were billed vaguely, procurement choices were defended with language that sounded confident and empty at the same time. That discovery mattered for a reason most people do not understand. It did not come from me. It came from the system turning inward. Once a system begins to protect itself from within, it becomes unpredictable. People start leaving paper trails for self-defense. They document conversations they used to keep informal. They forward emails to private accounts. They begin preparing for a version of the future where someone asks them what they knew and when they knew it. That is when the record starts to grow on its own. I was asked to meet Victor Hale in person after one of the longer compliance reviews. The message was polite. The tone was casual. It was framed as professional curiosity. His assistant said he wanted to speak briefly and privately. We met in a conference room with a view of the city, the kind of room that makes people feel important even when they are being managed. Victor Hale stood near the window when I arrived. He turned with a controlled smile that did not reach his eyes. He praised my work. He called me thorough. He asked about my background in a way that felt measured, as if he already had the answers and simply wanted to confirm them. Then he said my sister's name, Emily. He pronounced it correctly. My body reacted before my face did. Heat moved through my chest in a way I had not felt in years. I kept my expression steady because control had become instinct. Victor Hale watched me closely, not like a predator, but like a man validating data. He said he made it a habit to understand the people who influenced his work. He did not say the word revenge. He did not need to. Victor Hale offered me a role. Not a title meant for public display, but a position closer to the decisions. Better compensation, direct access, influence that would allow me to shape future projects. He framed it as an opportunity to correct problems from within, to avoid future tragedies, to make sure standards were upheld. He presented power like an apology. That was his most refined talent. He took harm and translated it into opportunity, then expected gratitude. I told him I would consider it. I left the room feeling the kind of calm that comes when you realize someone has underestimated you. He believed the offer was leverage. He believed it would distract me. He believed that proximity to power is always irresistible. He did not understand what proximity had cost me. For days afterward, I slept poorly, not because I was tempted by money, but because the offer forced my grief into a sharper focus. It forced me to consider what kind of person I had become. It forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that my patience had shaped me as much as my loss had. I had built my life around a long plan. Now the plan had become visible to the man it was designed for. I met him one last time, not in a boardroom, in a quiet restaurant he favored, the kind of place where discretion is part of the service and conversations disappear into soft lighting. He arrived composed, wearing the calm of a man who believed he could manage outcomes. He spoke about responsibility in an abstract way. He talked about infrastructure, about aging buildings, about economic realities. He spoke about probability, about risk, about how tragedies are statistically inevitable in complex systems. He was intelligent, he was articulate, he was careful, and he never, not once, allowed the conversation to touch the word fault. When he finished explaining, I told him who I was. I said my mother's name. I said my sister's name. I told him about the complaints that went unanswered and the inspections that never happened. I told him the fire had not been an accident in the way he wanted to believe accidents exist. I did not ask him for money. I did not ask him for power. I did not ask him for sympathy. I told him I wanted the record to be honest. Victor Hale did not confess. He did not apologize in a way that carried ownership. He offered language that softened responsibility and distributed it until it became weightless. He protected the version of himself he could live with. That was when I understood what my revenge had always been. It was never about forcing him to feel my pain. Pain can be denied. Pain can be rationalized. Pain can be reframed as personal. The only thing Victor Hale truly feared was a record that could not be negotiated. A record that followed him even after the meetings ended. A record that made his favorite story about himself impossible to maintain. I released everything. Not selectively, not strategically, completely. Every document, every revision, every internal contradiction, every memo that revealed the real priorities behind the public language, every audit trail, every meeting note, every email that showed how safety became optional when it threatened timelines and profits. I did not frame it. I did not add commentary. I did not attach my name. I let the system speak in its own language. Facts. The fallout was swift. Projects were halted, contracts froze, insurance investigations widened, lawsuits multiplied. Former partners distanced themselves with carefully worded statements. Boards asked for resignations. Investors asked for accountability in private and reassurance in public. Victor Hale resigned from several positions within weeks. He was not arrested. He was not led away in handcuffs. That kind of ending would have been too clean. He experienced something that reached deeper. He became a liability. In the months that followed, Victor Hale gave one final interview. He spoke about lessons learned, about complexity, about shared responsibility. He presented himself as reflective, cooperative, concerned about the community. His tone remained calm. He never said my mother's name. He never said my sister's name. He did not need to, because the record said everything he would not. After that, my life changed in small ways that did not look like victory. I returned to work out of habit more than necessity, but the meetings felt different. The language felt familiar in a way that made it sound hollow. I noticed how often people said integrity when they meant risk management. I noticed how often people said transparency when they meant public relations. Eventually, I stepped away. Not in a dramatic resignation. I simply stopped chasing proximity. I moved to a quieter place. I took work that was smaller and slower and more tangible. I helped organizations build compliance systems that were designed to prevent harm rather than defend it after harm had already occurred. I taught teams how to document honestly. I showed them how small shortcuts accumulate into large disasters. Most people assumed it was just professional passion. I let them assume. The memories came back gradually. Not as sharp pain, not as guilt, but as presence. My mother at the kitchen table, reading complaint emails aloud, her voice tired but steady. Emily practicing her violin, stopping to adjust her posture, starting again with determination. The sound of her playing was never perfect, but it was always honest. She always tried. For years, I had delayed the simplest part of grief, the part that has no action plan. My revenge had been a structure that kept me moving. It gave my days direction. It gave my loss a project. It kept me functional. When it ended, I finally had to feel the weight without turning it into work. I did not find peace. Peace is a word people use when they want the story to end politely. What I found was an ending, the kind of ending that does not erase the past but closes the loop, the kind that allows you to stop waking up with the same unfinished sentence in your chest, the kind that lets you move through the world without constantly calculating whether the system will fail again in the same way. The fire took my family. The waiting shaped me. The record made his comfort impossible. And when it was finally over, I was not empty.